welcome. Thank you for joining us here at the Urban Institute today and online for the webcast as we release our KidShare 2016 report and have this conversation about is spending on children part of the conversation. Feel free to tweet using the hashtag KidShare. I am Heather Hahn. I'm a senior fellow at the Urban Institute and a co-author of the KidShare report series. The KidShare 2016 report is our 10th in the annual series monitoring federal expenditures on children. This annual monitoring of tax expenditures and outlays on children helps policymakers, the public, and everyone who's interested track spending on children over time, including the scheduled spending in the future. These reports play an important role in informing decisions on federal budget priorities. They document not only spending on specific children's programs, but also how broad budget actions can affect children. The goal of the KidShare series is not to advocate for any particular change or particular level of spending, but really to provide the detailed information necessary for understanding the implications of federal budget decisions. We hope that KidShare 2016 will continue to focus attention on the vital matter of spending on children. I want to acknowledge my co-authors, our lead author, Sarah Edelstein, Julia Isaacs, and Jean Sturley, who are on the panel, and Ellen Steele. I also want to acknowledge the generosity of the funders of KidShare. We have several people from First Focus with us today, and I know people from the Annie Casey Foundation are joining us online. So thank you for making this possible. Before we launch into the panel discussion, I want to very quickly touch on some of the highlights of the KidShare 2016 report. So the title is KidShare, so let's start there. The children's share of federal budget outlays in 2015 was 10%. That's that small gray slice of the pie up there at the top. The large orange slice are the non-child portions of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And then we have in red the defense spending. That blue slice is one to watch. That is interest on the debt. And then that remaining yellow slice is all other spending in 2015. So that 10% that goes for children, where does that go? There are 10 programs that account for 3/4 of all federal expenditures on children. The largest of them is Medicaid at $82 billion in 2015. The next 3 largest programs for children are all tax provisions: the Earned Income Tax Credit, the Child Tax Credit, and the Dependent Exemption. Those don't get as much attention when we're talking about spending on children. Next is SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. And then we have another tax provision, the tax exemption on employer-sponsored health insurance. And then the top 10 is rounded out with Social Security, Child Nutrition, Title I for Education, and TANF. Spending on children has been flat in recent years. This chart shows federal expenditures on children, both tax reductions and outlays, from 2007 to 2015. We see that there was a bump up in federal investment in children during the recession when there was increased need. That bump has fallen, and spending on children has remained relatively flat for the last 4 years. When we put children's spending in context, though, in the larger time period and in the context of all federal outlays, we see that children's spending is getting squeezed. So this figure shows the share of federal budget outlays spent on children and other items from 1960 to 2026, projected to 2026. That small silver gray part at the bottom is the spending on children. So spending on children has grown since 1960, but in 2015, at 10%, it had already fallen from 2010, and it is projected to fall to 7.7% of federal budget outlays in 10 years. What you see in that blue section that is growing steadily over time, That is the non-child portions of Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. The other part that is growing is the little orange one, which is the interest on the debt. It is 6% in 2015 and projected to be 13% by 2026. So with the blue section and the orange section growing, all other spending is squeezed. That includes defense, and that includes all outlays that aren't categorized in these other sections. So what does that mean for the spending on children when we go from 10% down to 7.7% over the next 10 years? It means that spending is projected to fall in all areas. That means, so this chart is showing federal expenditures on children as a share of GDP in 2015, which is the blue bar, and 2026 is the red bar. And we see spending on children falling in tax provisions, nutrition, income security, education, early education and care, social services and training, and housing. Unless Congress takes action to change the direction of the current laws, excluding health, spending on children will decline even in absolute dollars by 2026, with the largest declines in spending on education. So those are just some of the highlights of the KidShare report. You can also see in the report how states are really vital for investment in children. States provide 2/3 of public support for children, primarily through spending on K-12 education. The report also shows how tax credits have become an increasingly important component of expenditures for children, how spending is outpacing revenues, and how spending subject to budget caps and sequestration as part of the Budget Control Act, those capped areas are falling while the other areas are not. The report also has detailed tables that provide much more information. Copies of the report are available in the hallway. I hope all of you here will pick one up. And for those of you watching online, the report is available through a link on the webpage for this event. All right, I now very much look forward to the panel discussion. We will have time for audience questions toward the end, and those of you watching online can submit questions to events@urban.org. And again, you can tweet at the hashtag KidShare. It is my honor to introduce Gene Sterling, who will moderate the panel. Gene is a creator and co-author of the KidShare series. He is an Institute Fellow and the Richard B. Fisher Chair at the Urban Institute. Among Gene's past positions, he has served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Department of the Treasury for Tax Analysis, President of the National Tax Association, Co-Director of the Urban Brookings Tax Policy Center, and Chair of the 1999 Technical Panel advising Social Security on its methods and assumptions. He is the author not only of KidShare, but also of 18 books. Most directly relevant to today's discussion, Gene chaired and co-authored the National Academy's report, Advancing the Power of Economic Evidence to Inform Investments in Children, Youth, and Families. So please join me in welcoming Gene and the rest of our panel.
Well, thank you, Heather. As Heather has indicated, the KidShare report that's issued this year is the 10th in an annual series. And much of the report is related to schedules of spending on children under current law. Now, that's not really meant to be a prediction. It's just an estimate of what current law provides under various budget assumptions by Congressional Budget Office and Office of Management and Budget. But to some extent, the estimates of what the current law was going to provide that we started providing over some 10 years ago are really starting to come true, as you'll see in Heather's, or as you saw in Heather's presentation. Our panel today is trying to answer a very specific question, whether spending on children is part of the public conversation, or perhaps more accurately, to what extent is it part of the public conversation, to what extent is it not, and what are the implications? Now, each of our panelists has an extraordinary range of expertise, and I feel embarrassed because I'm not going to read you the long bios, and I should have told Heather not to read so much of mine, even though she had sent me a note on it. But they're in many ways national leaders in their fields. Isabel Sawhill who's 3 persons to my left, is an expert on children and more broadly social programs, having served at Urban Brookings and at OMB in very high positions. Karlyn Bowman, who was a colleague of mine at AEI, is one of the world's experts on polling, and particularly on its use. She just applies common sense to this in ways that I think few others do. Michael Mitchell is an expert at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, particularly on state issues, and has worked a lot on higher education and issues affecting children, and again is one of the nation's leaders. And then, of course, I cannot forget to my far left, Julie Isaacs, who's been leading the KidShare report team for some time now, and is also an expert on not just on KidShare, but on children's issues, and is delightful. I'm really honored to be on the panel with these people. Belle does have one mark against her that the others don't. She was actually responsible for hiring me here at the Urban Institute. So let me just start very quickly with what Heather has presented. Very quickly, I'd like to just get the panelists' reactions to what Heather has presented, and we'll go further into some other questions. Anyone want to take it up? Any reactions to the data? Does anything
if nobody else is programmed to say anything, I will say that Heather's presentation was just as crisp and good and clear and interesting as it could have been. And I am so glad that Eugene and Julia and others here are working on this set of issues, and that you've had this long-term commitment to doing this work and to getting it out to the public. And your funders have stuck with you, and so I want to commend everyone who's had a role in this for doing it. I certainly use these data in my own work, and I think many, many other people do as well. I could say a lot more and will, but maybe you want to give some other people a chance first.
I'll follow up and just say that it's always exciting as a person who focuses on state budget and tax policy to see both sides of that conversation happen. So not only the federal investments in children, which I think gets a lot of attention, but also the consideration that states play a very large role in this conversation as well.
Okay. So Karlyn, I have a question for you. You know better than almost anyone the relationship between information that can be gleaned from polls and the deeper base of knowledge that the public actually may have and how it affects the way they act. So what did the polls tell us, and what don't they tell us? To what extent have pollsters even been engaged in this issue over time? And to what extent are people responsive to those polls?
Thank you, Gene. It's a great pleasure to be back at Urban and to see you again after so many years. And I too want to congratulate you on this report. I quickly skimmed it, and it's very, very useful, I think, for many people in this field. But I'd like to say a word about the polling profession and how it's changed and what I think we can learn from the polls about children's issues. The polling business today is increasingly driven by the interests of the pollsters' media partners, and this is especially true in an election year. Last Wednesday alone, we had 20 different polls on the presidential contests. We know, for example, that people think that Hillary Clinton would be a better role model than Donald Trump for America's children, but we know precious little about the concerns that Americans have about the needs of America's children. It would be tempting to say that the children are not a priority for the pollsters, but I don't think that that would be fair either. Polls are blunt, crude instruments, and they're not well suited to policy developments or to trade-offs. So I don't think we know which aspects, to answer your specific question, which aspects of spending on children engage the public more. People speak to the pollsters in general terms, not in policy specifics. Americans aren't well informed about demographic change or policy generally. They start with their values, and this is what polls are most useful for. We know, for example, today that most Americans are concerned about the prospects for most children today. And concerns about our children's future is always a hearty perennial of presidential campaigns, but this year it's been discussed in a different way. Both Trump and Clinton have invoked the past to talk about children. Trump in terms of America's greatness, and Hillary Clinton, who has said on many occasions that times were better for Americans in the late 1990s. So the nostalgia impulse has produced quite a few questions this year about whether life for children was better than in the past. Majorities usually say that it was. Historically, the pull of the past has always been strong. In a Gallup question, just to give you one example, from the 1930s, people said that life was better in the horse and buggy days. People are clearly then concerned about the prospects for most children. It's a core value. But here we see a familiar dynamic that we often see in the polls. People are more confident that life will be better for their children. African Americans and Hispanics, parents are especially likely to give this response. It's similar to the poll questions that we have about all members of Congress and my member of Congress. People are always much more positive about their individual member, though this year that may not be the case. I tend to trust from polls what people say about their own lives and their own children. We also know that the very low levels of trust that people have in Washington is now spilling over to their views about making the right decisions when it comes to children. A poll conducted by the National Journal and the Allstate Partnership asked people how much they trusted various people or groups to make the right decisions when it comes to children. Congress ranked second to last. Only 28% had a great deal or some trust in it. The only group to get a worse rating was companies that produce video games and movies for children. We know that parents are concerned about the coarsening of the culture, another central value. They're much more likely to say today that ideas and solutions to the biggest economic and social challenges facing America will come from state and local institutions such as government, business, and community organizations than they are to believe that those solutions will come from the federal government. Again, painting in very broad strokes, we see in the polls a deep compassion that Americans feel for groups that aren't able to fend for themselves. Pew asked about how much help the federal government should provide for different groups, and the responses in 2011 and 2015 were virtually identical. Slightly more than 6 in 10 in late 2015 said that the federal government doesn't pay enough attention to older people. 62% gave that response about the middle class, and 59% about poor people and separately children. We don't usually take surveys at AEI, but this year we replicated a 1985 survey done by the Los Angeles Times on poverty. The sample was large enough to be confident of the responses of the poor themselves. We asked in both groups which groups of people you would like to see get more help from the federal government. In both years, quite a distance apart, 1985 and 2016, more people said that children in poverty was the most important group, and that was followed by the elderly in poverty. 6 in 10 in another question in the survey said that the number of children living in poverty was increasing from year to year. More people gave that response about children than other groups such as blacks or Hispanics or whites. Large majorities of those who were designated as poor and not poor in the survey said that most children in poverty live in single-parent homes. Pre-K has gotten quite a bit of attention in the campaign, and Gallup recently found that 70% favored using federal money to increase funding to make sure that high-quality programs are available to every child in America. But pre-K ranked below high school, elementary school, middle school, and college in terms of high importance to later success in life. So I think if you look at the polls in terms of the way people talk about their values, you'll actually learn a lot more than the specific questions on policy recommendations. In 2016, there have only been 100 questions in the polling literature on children. And so I think we have a long way to go in sort of understanding more about people's values and also their policy priorities.
It's very interesting. I'd invite the rest of the panelists to respond. And in your response, I wonder if you could also address the conundrum when people get asked specifically about things like spending and taxes. So if we ask them if they favor a spending increase that they benefit from, they say yes. If they say, do they favor a tax cut that they would benefit from, they say yes. And they very seldom deal with how the numbers add up. And that's somewhat happens we might get into this later, it's very simplistic polling. But I'm just, how do those who favor additional resources for children, how do they deal with that conundrum? You know, that people always want more of one thing, but they don't necessarily want to provide the resources to deal with it. And they have trouble dealing with the trade-offs that might be required. The type of trade-offs I think that Heather was outlining in many ways come out through our budget process.
I thought it was interesting that Heather emphasized that much of the budget for children is going in the form of tax credits, and I think that is because they are more politically popular than spending programs. The earned income tax credit has certainly been a huge help. We also have a tax credit for child care, which hasn't gotten a lot of discussion. And the interesting thing about the child care tax credit, there's also a child credit that's separate from the child care one, but the child care tax credit goes to everybody. There's no cap at the top. If you're Bill Gates, you can get the child care tax credit. And people at the bottom, by and large, don't get any benefit from it because it is only offset against your taxes if you have positive income taxes to pay. And there have been various proposals to change that, to cap it at the top, and to make it refundable at the bottom, or to at least change it from a deduction into change the structure of it. I don't want to get into the weeds here. But I suspect that if you, depending upon the outcome of this election, and I don't want to get partisan here, but it's pretty clear that Hillary Clinton has been devoted to the cause of helping children and families most of her career, and that she has lots of proposals to do so. I suspect she would do something to change the tax credit. She's already put forward proposals on paid leave and on child care that should help families with children. Now, whether Congress would then react positively to any such proposals, I think, is a big question mark. Many of us, I think, assume that even if the Senate were to go Democrat, the House probably would not. And so there will be still these issues that you've written so much about, Jean, which is that the federal budget is very hard to move in any new direction, whether it's to help children or the poor or any other group. And the reason is because, as Heather's slides showed, most of the budget goes for these big items like Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, interest on the debt, and they are indeed squeezing out programs for kids and programs for the poor. So that is something that I think is going to require more than just a new person in the White House, as much as that might help, but also maybe a change in budget procedures of some kind that doesn't always preference entitlement spending over what's usually called domestic discretionary spending, where most of these or many of these programs for children are lodged. And that is the part of the budget that's getting smaller and smaller. So, you know, Jean made the point that long term, the report, the Kids Share report, is talking about a projection based on current law, not a prediction. And so I think many of us who care about families and children are hoping that that projection will not be a prediction, that we can do more for families and kids. And so I just ask us all to think about how that might happen. I kind of think, Michael, it's going to be in the state, local level where the politics are less dysfunctional, where there is already a lot of spending on children. And so I'm sure you're going to address that. I'll just make one more brief point. The Census Bureau released its regular report on family incomes and poverty last week, and there was a lot of really good news in that report. Average family income went up by 5.2%. That's huge. We're still not back to where we were in 2007. We're not even back to where we were in 1999 at the end of the Clinton administration. So we still have a ways to go. Still, it was very good news, and the increases in family income were greatest for those towards the bottom of the distribution, and the poverty rate came down a lot, and especially it came down amongst kids. I think the lesson from that report is that a tight labor market is one of the best things you can do for less advantaged families with kids. Recall that the report was about the difference between 2015 and 2014. In other words, the gains in 2015 over 2014. The unemployment rate came down almost a full percentage point between those 2 years. That's very large. And we saw a similar pattern in the late 1990s, which is the last time we had really tight labor markets and the last time that families at the bottom of the distribution, who tend to be the ones with kids, because they're younger and because if you're raising kids, you're going to be more stretched and so forth. So I just want to leave that message about the importance of tight labor markets.
Karlyn, you wanted to jump in?
One thing that I've noticed, not only in this area, but in many others in survey research, is that the massive contradictions in people's attitudes about taxes and spending. You see it in so many other areas. And when that tends to happen, people tend to pull away from a debate. They don't become engaged in it. It seems too complex. The trade-offs are so hard, so they pull away from the debate. And in a way, that's a backhanded compliment to representative democracy in some ways, because we expect all these actors in Washington to somehow resolve the tensions that we can't resolve in our own thinking. And I think Belle's point about the functional politics at the state level being where some of these changes may come is important, because there people really are much more confident that actors can make a difference.
Michael, you've got a couple lead-ins here about state policy, and you've written a lot about what's going on at the state level, particularly like the declines in higher education, but other higher education spending as well as other areas. What do you see in your work, and how does it relate to what we've been talking about here in this report?
So taking a step back, I think that states are very interesting in the sense that on any given year, a state has to balance its budget. And so there is no, we can have both. It's always a question of which do you want more. And so it's a question of, do you want lower taxes? Do we want higher taxes? Smaller investments in children or greater investments? And as you can imagine, there is no one-size-fits-all answer for all of the states. And so in any given year, in any given state, given the specifics of a proposal, who's proposing it, the favorability of the governor, all of those things are going to have implications for whether or not people see a trade-off as a positive or as a net negative. And I think that one thing that the polling does confirm is something that's kind of come up through behavioral economics and behavioral psychology, is that people are loss averse, such that if the debate is around getting rid of a service or getting rid of programs for kids versus a tax cut, they're averse to getting rid of that program or service. Whereas if the conversation is around a tax increase for additional services, they may not necessarily support that tax increase. And so I think that is something that we need to talk about when we're making the connection for voters across the states or at the federal level. And there are plenty of real-world examples as well where voters have looked to increase revenue to make investments in kids across the states at the local level as well, especially when we're talking about funding for schools. And I think another dynamic to this conversation that we need to add is for a lot of low-income families, especially when we're talking about state taxes, disproportionately low-income families are bearing the burden as a share of their incomes relative to families up the income spectrum. So it's not only a question of what are we investing in and do we have the resources, but how are we raising those resources? And is it presented in a way that's amenable to low-income families, middle-income families as well?
You know, Belle mentioned at the federal level the pressure from the entitlements, which are largely health and retirement. To what extent do you see the same pressure at the state level? I remember, this was actually maybe at least 10 years ago, but I remember one governor literally telling me that the pressure, for instance, from just the Medicaid budget alone, he wasn't necessarily talking about education, but he said it left them almost no discretion to be doing other things. Do you see the similar things going on there? And
we do.
Are they getting better or worse?
It's a trend that's been going on for quite some time. As you mentioned, Medicaid is one of those pressures, health spending. Corrections spending is another area of state budgets that has continued to grow. Today, states are spending around $50 billion just in their correction budgets. If you were to look back at the mid-1980s, as a share of, as adjusted for inflation, that number has nearly doubled. And so that presents a huge pressure on state budgets. And politically and historically, Correction spending has had a kind of constituency that has had a very strong presence in state legislatures. It's very difficult for state lawmakers to go against that public safety narrative. And then you have to just talk about the constituencies, law enforcement, prosecutors, police unions. All of those things kind of present real barriers when you're talking about making decisions between investing in prisons or investing in children in schools.
Julie, you've been involved with these reports for a number of years now, as well as doing a lot of research on other child issues. So what do you see as the public reaction, if not in the polls elsewhere? And what types of press reports, for instance, do you find that this type of information generates?
Yeah, well, let me start with the press reports before the public reaction, because it's easier for us to sort of track those, because we do sort of follow the clippings. So we have a number of people that will pull out one factoid from the report. For instance, Cory Booker tweeted 2 cents on the dollar. That's the fact. I'm not sure if Heather shared or not, but the government's projected to grow over the next decade by nearly 1.5 trillion, and kids will get 2 cents on the dollar of that increase. That's probably one of the findings that people find surprising and does get tweeted or quoted. Another type of sort of press, and it's often blogs by our colleagues in think tanks and all, or articles that highlight the fact that spending on children is so much higher than spending on the elderly. Some people cite this finding, and as well as the fact that interest payments on the national debt will exceed federal spending on children in the near future. They write blogs or articles about how this is somewhat alarming and what's happening with our priorities, and that more should be done for children. Another example, Inside Philanthropy, article, something like that name, In Philanthropy, was talking about spending on children and then talking about a big initiative to spend more on early childhood education. And finally, another type of press report we get, we get a number of blogs and articles that criticize us for publicizing these estimates that show the spending on children is getting smaller, and that show the higher spending on retirement, and show some of the differences between children and the elderly, which I should say, it's higher at the federal level because of Social Security and Medicare, and then if you add in the states with all this public school spending, the ratio, which is 6 to 1 at the federal level, is more like 2.3 to 1 when you add in the state and local, which is one reason we add in the state and local. And it's not that people quarrel with the numbers or the way we've crunched the numbers, but they criticize us doing the estimates, saying we shouldn't publicize this and that we would be encouraging generational warfare and undermining support for social programs. So that's some of the reaction we get. The public reaction is a little harder to judge. I'm not a pollster, but my sense when I talk to people about the findings is the federal budget is fairly confusing, and I think there's a fair amount of misunderstanding. There are some people more on the left who think there's enough bloat in the Pentagon that if we just solve that problem, we wouldn't have these federal budget problems. And I think there are people on the right that think you get rid of fraud and abuse in social programs and the problems would go away. But if you look at some of the numbers in this report, I think my favorite is figure 6, which didn't make it into Heather's 5 figures she could put up. It just shows that the levels of spending and the levels of revenue and the gap between them, and there isn't enough. It's not, the math is fairly hard solving that problem. And so I think the way people are reacting, it was interesting to hear you say they're disengaging. I think they're a little bit in denial that it's not true. That we don't need to raise taxes and we don't need to cut spending. We can really solve this in some other way. And I don't see that other way.
I wonder if any of you, I'm trying to think of, so we have this discussion about spending on children, we dig deeply into the programs, and yet we see the public reaction, at least what we see now in terms of the campaign, has been a debate over child care, which I don't even know was on the radar screen very much a year ago. So I'm curious how people translate the facts and the information we might be presenting with what then catches on as a public concern. And the opposite end might be something like early childhood education, which has been advocated for 30 years now, with moderate progress in some areas, but at a very, very, very slow pace. I wonder if anybody can reconcile. I can't, but can anybody reconcile those,
Sure. children don't vote, but their mothers do and their fathers. So child care is something that helps the adults in the family as well as the kids. And to some extent, that's true of pre-K. I mean, all parents want their kids to be better educated, and if they're convinced from the media or from the experts that early education is important to your development, they're going to be for that. I want to mention also something that you all sent me as a potential question here, which is what difference has the kind of work that we all do to evaluate programs and figure out how they translate into better lives for kids down the road.
In fact, that was my next question for
All
you.
right.
And you might refer to it, we're talking about performance measurement, we're talking about cost-benefit analysis, we're talking about these attempts to very specifically identify what programs work and don't work.
Exactly.
So please continue.
So the Obama administration has put huge emphasis on evidence-based programming. And we even have a new acronym that I discovered at a conference last week. Everybody was talking about EBP, and I didn't know what it was. And finally it occurred to me it's evidence-based programming. Now I want to give a shout out for Julia in this context, because many years ago, gosh, Julia, I can't remember when it was that you were at Brookings, something like 7 years ago, you wrote a report on what we knew about the effectiveness of programs for children. And one of those programs was nurse-family partnership, or home visiting, or parenting programs. And there was very rigorous evidence from randomized controlled trials that nurse-family partnership had positive effects. And the Congress, on a bipartisan basis, then got behind that program and eventually got included in the Affordable Care Act. And I don't remember the exact number now of how much is being spent on it, but many hundreds of, do you know the figure? Hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Anyway, it's all around the country now, and there's more evaluation going on. But the point is that we do need, I think, to show that programs work. There can be a downside to that. The downside can be that we don't really ask whether, let's say, Medicare or Social Security or interest on the debt pass a benefit cost test. You know, they just are things that we think are necessary in a civilized democracy, and we don't subject them to the same kind of rigor. So I have some concerns about the process, and sometimes I think that you know, we could go too far with that. And it's also often the case that the evidence is very mixed, and it's very hard for somebody in public life or even in the media to deal with what we all do as researchers, which is to say, on the one hand, on the other. So I like the fact that Julia had her success with the nurse-family partnership, but I also like the fact that this report, Kids Share, is descriptive. It doesn't try to get behind the numbers and say whether or not these programs work or not, although I can imagine doing more of that. Does the report have anything on effectiveness in it? I don't know. We didn't get a copy in advance. Yeah.
No, it just came out today,
Yeah,
and
okay.
I need to get you a copy. No, the question of what is most effective spending on children is a good one, and that was a fun project I did for you about 10 years ago. The broader question, I mean, it is interesting how there's lots of evaluations of early childhood education, but then there's whole areas that are not evaluated. And I know that 10 years ago, for example, it was hard for me to find programs on children's health programs, because people just thought, well, kids should get health care. We don't need to evaluate whether it's a good thing or not. I think in the last 10 years there's been more showing the impact of expanding health insurance coverage. But it wasn't interesting when I was surveying where is there evidence, what works, that there were areas within children, in that case children's health, that people thought we don't need to evaluate whether it works, we just want children to have health insurance, and that there's whole areas of the government where we don't evaluate. So I think, like you, I feel that more evidence is good. But it is sometimes challenging that we put so much focus on, well, the early childhood education has shown us there's a lot of evidence there. We have a lot of evidence there. And then there's whole areas of the government that we just support because we want to, and we don't try to see what is the impact.
You know, even the pre-K area is contentious right now because we have earlier programs like Perry Preschool and Abecedarian that showed very large positive impacts on children's later life chances. And then we had more recently a pretty good evaluation was done in the state of Tennessee and a national Head Start study with randomized controlled trial. And those were much more, those were disappointing in their impacts. But then we have a lot of now public preschool in places like Tulsa and Boston and other states where the evidence is pretty strong. And so, you know, but it's, you know, it's just taken me, longer than I'd like to just go through that. And imagine if you're a busy policymaker, can you give me a yes, no answer, this stuff work or it doesn't, you know, and you kind of have to say, well, it depends. That's a hard thing to do.
Michael?
You know, I can't help but notice this parallel at the state level between what you want to fund through your budget and what kind of gets funded through the tax code for many states. And you know, on an annual basis or on a biennial basis, lawmakers are going to come together and look at their budget and scrutinize every line because they have to make sure that spending matches revenue. But year after year, in only a very small number of states, are they applying that same level of scrutiny to tax expenditures. In most states, when those things get onto the books, they sit there and their special interests are able to reap the benefit. And as a consequence, there are fewer resources on hand to invest in kids and invest in other areas of state budgets. And so I think that that's another area where there is actually the lack of accountability that makes it more difficult to put money into things that we care about. And another item that's kind of on the fiscal angle is these things called fiscal notes, which at the state level are just documents that get put out with bill proposals that show some of the benefits and costs that are associated with various pieces of legislation. And right now in a lot of states, those are highly politicized documents or they're just of poor quality, and it's very difficult to see the full range of benefits both to the state, both socially, that could come along with some of the investments that we want to make.
So an interesting aspect of budget decision making is, and whether it's in the household or in government, is that the money you have you're going to allocate. You're going to put it one place or the other. And I wonder sometimes if the attempt at, say, very good performance measurement, cost-benefit analysis, dodges the issue that we're going to make this relative decision. So at home we might read our consumer reports and decide we're going to put money into this particular TV versus that particular TV or stuff like that. But we also at a broader level just decide, are we going to put more money into housing? Are we going to buy furniture? We have this, are we going to put it in savings accounts? We have to do something with the money. And so in relative analysis, often we don't prove that every single dollar we spend has met some marginal maximum benefit to cost, but we have to allocate it. And I wonder sometimes if the attempt to put kids programs into this performance measurement dodges this issue that we're on a relative basis, even if the Head Start programs you mentioned, Belle, might have mixed results in terms of, say, rates of return, that still might be a higher rate of return than just throwing the money into tax cuts or defense or spending on adults, whatever it is.
Yeah, we don't ask what the benefit cost is of sending someone to third grade.
But I'm saying we will spend the money no matter, with the revenues, we might put it in the form of tax cuts, we will do something with that money one way or the other. And I wonder how we answer that type of question, which is partly what I think the Kid Share report is about, is how do you think about it in a broader budget context? I don't know whether any of you have, Karlyn, is there any way that we could even think about raising that talk about the difficulty of going down into what's sometimes called deliberative polling, where we go from sort of the simplest question to really informing the public of facts and information, hopefully not in a biased way, that gets them into a more deliberative thought about what to do. Is there any way to broach these difficult issues?
I think that's useful, it's interesting, but I'm not sure I trust the hypotheticals. I'm not sure I trust the continued evaluation data. I've seen too much of it where you can move the needle slightly by changing some of the assumptions, so I'm a skeptic about that, but that's all we have in some ways with an incredibly inattentive public. I mean, we're all deeply concerned about kids' issues in this room, but how many of you are going to go home tonight and read about climate change and decide what priority we should give to climate change? You've got an incredibly inattentive public, and you know, when it's a choice between the kids' soccer game and thinking about federal spending, you know, it's a pretty clear choice overall. So I think these things are extremely difficult. The deliberative polling is somewhat useful, but again, people often respond to cues in the way those questions are presented.
This is a reminder to those of you who are not here physically but are stay tuning to us, is the hashtag, or you could tweet at KidShare, or hashtag KidShare. And if you have questions, we're going to be going to questions in about 10 minutes or so. The address is events@urban.org. Please submit your questions to events@urban.org. So one of the aspects of the report that's also very interesting when we compare these relative growth of different programs is the extent to which the kids programs, A, are the discretionary side of the budget, and B, the extent to which many of them are means tested, particularly if they're on the spending versus the tax side. And the programs that grow tend to be more on the entitlement or the permanent side of the budget. Let me include there the child credit, which is permanent in the tax code, and they tend less to be means tested. So sometimes I wonder whether what we see happening to spending on children might be an accident of history, and what programs got more permanent status had growth built into them versus those that were put on a discretionary basis. And we tend to debate more on a means-tested basis, as opposed to some formal decision by decision makers today or others that this is the direction that they want the budget to go. And if I'm right, the question is, what can be done about it? Is there room to put children's programs on mandatory growth paths? Should we be means testing a lot of other things? Should we means test public education? I mean, a question for me is, are there things we need to be thinking about in terms of changing this mix of the way we make decisions? You alluded to this a little bit earlier, Belle, in a sort of very quickly, that maybe we need a different budget process itself if we want to tackle these types of issues.
That was exactly what I was thinking about. You just articulated it better than I could.
More long-winded.
What's that?
I articulated it in a more long-winded way.
Well, I did just allude to it, yes. But it's the kind of thing I had in mind because I really do think that children's programs have been relegated to this part of the budget that's being squeezed. And I think your point about the fact that many of them are means tested, whereas programs for the elderly tend not to be means tested, is a very important point. And this brings me back to something that Karlyn might want to say more about, and that is, I think when the public looks at children, they don't think about children as separated from their families. And they think that the first responsibility for raising a child is the parents. I mean, Bill Clinton used to say, governments don't raise children, parents do. And I think that's right. So then the question is, how do we talk about that? Karlyn, do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I actually looked at a few questions about that recently. Allstate and National Journal has asked a trade-off question about the sort of it takes a village versus parental responsibility. And though the numbers are closer, I think, than they were 10 years ago, and again, questions are asked very infrequently, parents still have the major responsibility, and people are skeptical about federal government involvement. You can go back to Roper polls from the 1930s about whether or not the federal government should have a lot of involvement in raising children or paying for education. People are very, very skeptical again, just because the government's big, it's intrusive, and it's not my family, as you said.
That's very interesting.
So, Jean, if I could just jump in on this,
please.
it does seem that one of the second chart Heather showed, if we look at the largest programs of spending on children, we're ranking them just by the children's share. So we're just showing the children's share of Medicaid or the children's share of Social Security. The largest programs there, Medicaid is, well, the states can control it, but the federal part of it is an entitlement to the states once they set their laws. But then there were the tax credits. So earned income tax credit is an example where it does seem as if some of the growth in children's spending is in these areas. That's not the discretionary part of the budget. And in fact, a fair amount of children's spending is in, so the things like childcare and education are in this discretionary piece that is very hard to get through the Appropriations Committee any increase because it's very much of a pie situation. What you give to this person, you're not giving to that. But both the entitlement and the tax credit, there's a fair amount of children's spending there, and that may be why we have seen children's spending remain at 10% of the budget. In some sense, people could see that as a success, those that are looking for supporting children with federal dollars, which of course the parent is the first person that takes care of the child, but the federal government supplementing, some families don't make enough to support their children. And some people homeschool, but most of us send our children to public schools. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. But that it seems that there is some children's spending that is in this discretionary piece, but a fair amount, if you look at the report, is in Medicaid, earned income tax credit, child tax credit. And so perhaps children's spending has been protected somewhat by being in these areas.
I think that's an important point. Is there a figure in the report on what happens to children's share when you take out the tax subsidies and tax credits?
Yes, there is a figure which, well, we also take, yes, there's two figures that look at the spending by type. And so we have one, I'm looking at figure 14, and there's figure 15. One of them looks at, so discretionary is going down much more. This is looking into projections for the future. But the mandatory spending also is going down as a percent of GDP, looking at sort of, when you're looking over 10 years, you want to see how much we're investing.
Right.
You mean the mandatory spending for
You're
children?
an aging population. So.
Mandatory spending on children, yes. And the other interesting thing, just while I'm talking about the weeds, is that when you look at children's spending, what's happening in health is like this. It is going up, children's spending on health, which is, and then it's all the other areas are going down, and that's where we come out at about flat, more or less flat.
So one of the arguments that's been made over time is that one reason spending for children has a problem is because the aged vote and the aged are concerned about themselves, and that's part of what's going on. I'm not actually totally convinced by that argument. Karlyn, you mentioned the values question, and that children are always in the value. When we look at the value side of the equation, people always have a concern for the values of children. So is this argument that part of what's going on is that the aged have less concern for children? Is that really a valid argument, or is it something that some or other gets twisted when we go through the political process?
I think it gets twisted when we go through the political process. I think the older generation is very concerned about the younger generation, about their children and their grandchildren. You can see it in so many different ways, and so I think that does get twisted. The selfish elderly, I just don't see a lot of evidence of that in the survey data.
And they think you can do it all, as we said earlier, right? You know,
yes.
I want my Social Security and my Medicare, but I also want my grandchildren to have various things.
Right. I think we even see. I think even when they did polls of Tea Party people, they said, "Keep your hands off my Medicare and my Social Security," if I remember correctly.
That's right.
All right. So it's about time actually to go to questions, and I think I will open up for questions from the audience as well as from those not here physically. Again, if you are outside the Urban Institute room, please send your question to events@urban.org. And I'll try to be fair and try to go around the room and catch as many as I can. So I'm going to start all the way back in the corner, and that way we can, supposed to always catch the person in front.
This is a great
Please, I'm sorry, two rules. One, please wait for the microphone. The other thing is please make you could have a short introduction, but please make a question for the audience. And the phrase "n'est-ce pas," is it not so, after a statement does not qualify, at least for this purpose, as a question. So please go ahead.
Thank you. My name's Rich Bland. I work for Save the Children. And we're more known for our international programs, but we have domestic programs. We were founded in Appalachia, and we're focused on the most deprived. We're in 22 states, and the trend, my question is this trend of evidence-based programming or performance-based programming. And this is going to kind of date me, but at least Jean will know. How do we, everyone is in favor of evidence-based and effective programming, but how do we make sure it's not kind of a Trojan horse? And here's why. Supply-side economics in the 80s, some people, and David Stockman, who was head of OMB, ended up admitting was starve the beast strategy, or at least was used to reduce revenues, which would then reduce social services. You get debate on that, but it was used for that purpose by some folks. 90s, you have privatization, and then things that were too expensive ended up excluding the most deprived. We're finding more and more states, say Mississippi specifically, are doing performance-based budgeting, cutting programs that aren't shown as effective or can't afford RCTs, to Belle's point, for rural places, and you end up hurting the most deprived. So how do we be in favor, and academics be in favor of effective and performance-based programming, but not reduce services to the most deprived?
Well, I don't know. Do you think that those programs, it sounds like political decisions are being made when you're cutting programs, and that evidence-based programming is one of the tools that's used. And so I think it's just those of us that work in policy have to remember that that our reports are useful, but there's a whole political side to those decisions.
I mean, I would add to that the following important point, which is if we believe the evidence, if it's really good, solid, independent evidence, we shouldn't want to spend money on programs that aren't working. When I was in OMB, I was an associate director. I had responsibilities in the Clinton administration for all of the human service programs, social programs of the federal government. And there was evidence at that time that the JTPA, the Job Training Partnership Act, the training programs for kids, talking about teenagers now, had not been effective. They had been more effective for adults, but not for the young. And so I basically cut those programs. And they, in fact, were cut. And I had to worry about, could I sleep through the fact that I had actually had some influence on these programs being cut. And I had to tell myself, well, if they don't work, we shouldn't have them. Here's the rub, though. If the money is not reallocated to a more effective program for kids, and you think that kids need more help in our society, that we do need some reallocation from other areas of the budget to the kids, then the fear is that you cut a program and the money gets reallocated to something else that may not be effective either, just may be more politically popular. So I think the reallocation question becomes critical.
Michael, the question related a lot to what's going on at the state level, too. Maybe you can elaborate.
Yeah, and I think the narrative up until a few years has been reform, and it's kind of ended at that point, right? Reform. What's evidence-based? And if it's not evidence-based, cut it. But the phrase now that's emerging is reform and reinvestment. The idea that you have a goal, you have a priority, and maybe the program or service that you're providing right now does not meet that goal, but the second piece of that, the reinvestment, means that you're going to look at the next program or next service that can get you there. This is something that's happening a lot in the criminal justice and juvenile justice worlds right now, where states are looking at ways of reforming criminal justice systems or juvenile justice systems, generating savings within those budget areas, and then reinvesting into programs that either have some evidence behind them or pilot programs that necessarily don't have it yet, but with a few dollars could start the ball rolling and gain momentum so that they do have the evidence down the road. So it's that second piece that's really critical right now.
It actually reminds me at Treasury, we often played this trick when we were dealing with single proposals, is we'd force people to try to have a revenue neutral or a deficit neutral proposal so they could make relative comparisons. And this is almost your reform reinvestment just almost exactly reminds me of that attempt to narrow the question. Do you have a question here?
Hi, I'm Amy Harfeld from the Children's Advocacy Institute. My nonprofit focuses mostly on vulnerable youth, especially youth in the child welfare system and youth aging out of that system. I want to thank you for the forum and for the report, which is very helpful. My question for the panelists is, there have been some discussions recently about how we can improve messaging in the children's community about increased investments, and what are the best tools to powerfully impact increasing investments in children. Now, evidence-based programs have gained a lot of popularity and have had a lot of success because we can show the value of investing something where there's proof that it works. But as some of you have pointed towards, a lot of investments we make in children are simply investments that we make because we know it's the right thing to do, and because we know that there are young, vulnerable people on the other end of necessary prevention and treatment. My question is, with the lack of evidence-based programs and evidence about a lot of investments in children, how can we better use the tools within this report and make arguments more focused on value and returns on investment, which we all know are the case when you invest in young people who, of course, have no political capital. So when we make arguments on the Hill and in our communities and at the state level as well, we have to make an argument that focuses on value, why it's worth it, how much money will this save us down the road when we invest more in early education, or on the front end of child welfare, or in youth aging out of foster care who are going to probably end up homeless or in jail or costing us quite a lot of money down the road. I'm wondering if any of you have thoughts about how we can better make those arguments on value and returns on investment for areas that don't have evidence-based numbers for us.
I want to draw your attention to, or make an advertisement for, a life cycle model that was originally created at Brookings, but is now a partnership between the Urban Institute, Brookings, and Child Trends. And what this model does is it says, if you can show, however you want, that a program has an impact on some immediate outcome for kids, you can then feed that outcome, that improved outcome, through the model all the way up to when that child is an adult, let's say when they're age 40. And you can look at what the impact is on their income, how much their income is increased because they got more education, or because they got some child welfare services, or they got some home visiting, or whatever it is that they got. And then you can figure out what that's going to be worth in terms of a revenue reflow to the government and how much it costs, and do a little, benefit cost analysis. And when we've done that with the model, those at the Urban Institute here and at Child Trends, we have shown that just picking 4 or 5 good, strong programs, they have been evaluated, and running them through the model, if we gave every low-income child in America those 4 or 5 programs, we could close 75 to 80% of the gap in income at age 40 between the higher income and the lower income kids. I think it's a powerful tool. One could raise questions about whether the data are all correct, whether the model is, perfect, but as rough orders of magnitude, it really shows big impact. And when I show it to general audiences, I showed it at a Federal Reserve conference 10 days ago with lots of community leaders there. They were really woken up by this kind of evidence, for whatever it's worth. But that's something I just happen to know about.
Next question, right here.
Thank you. I'm Suzanne McCartney from ASPE at HHS, and I just wanted to ask about...
Put your microphone up.
Thank you. I wanted to ask about something a little more narrow, which is income security programs. And I see in your report that in several cases, TANF specifically, as a share of program dollars going to children is projected to fall, and some other programs, maybe Social Security or SSI, are projected to sort of level off. Do you have any particular reading on this, or I'm just thinking about for future research or investigation, what are your additional thoughts on this, on income security programs specifically going forward? If any?
Well, Heather is one of our experts. I'll start, and Heather will jump up. But well, those two you mentioned, I mean, SSI is an entitlement which will grow if the number of disabled children grows, and also the benefits are tied to inflation, whereas TANF is sort of a flat amount. And because in our report we adjust everything for inflation, and in fact a number of our projections for the future, we look at things as relative to the economy, which is very useful when you're looking over a 50-year period or looking forward 10 years. And so a flat program actually goes down. And so that's what I would say, is that the TANF program, the amount of cash assistance already has gone down from 96. Well, as you know, there's also how states allocate the TANF dollars. But even if the amount allocated was the same, if it's a flat amount with inflation, the value goes down. And over a 10-year period or a 20-year period, it goes down quite a bit.
Michael, do you see any pressure on those programs at the state level?
Oh, absolutely. I think that, especially when you're talking about a program such as TANF, which again is also highly politicized, and there are constantly efforts to think about how you can reallocate and kind of maneuver around TANF dollars with, unfortunately at times not necessarily the recipients, necessarily the recipient's best interest, but to make a political interest, and that can have huge implications for just kind of the sustainability and how those programs end up playing out.
Karlyn, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm guessing in the polls that because TANF is often identified as welfare, but things like the earned income credit are not, that actually also has an influence on how policy has evolved.
Yeah, I think certainly it does, yes.
Heather, you got an invitation to jump in here. Did you want to add something? Julia did. Okay. You have a question over here?
My name's Robert Mahaffey. I'm the Executive Director of the Rural School and Community Trust. We advocate on behalf of rural children and families across the country, particularly those that live in very remote and high poverty places. I'd like to thank you to the panel and to the Urban Institute. It's great to be here with our friends at the Urban Institute. I'd like to focus on Title I in the Every Student Succeeds Act, No Child Left Behind, going all the way back to 65, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. The formulas in Title I are number weighted. So the formulas really look at population size, and then they look at levels of poverty. So our research has shown that remote rural children who are poor receive significantly less per pupil spending in Title I than concentrations of poverty in urban centers. So my question to the panel, and there's a lot of discussion on the Hill about this, we've done a lot of research, we're looking at ways to add social justice issues into those formulas so that the population size does not dictate so much the per pupil spending in Title I. Comments?
More like you, but
Anyone?
What we look at is the total Title I spending, and so all I can say is that because education, as you know, is in the non-defense discretionary portion, it is the education programs which are, they're not predictions, they're projections. That is, if we just follow the CBO baseline, would go down more than any other area, which is a different question than who gets it, but it's what we address in the report.
I would guess politically you've got a really steep hill to climb because politicians care about population.
We're working on it.
Yeah.
I wonder to set, a lot of times we find programs too are boxed in by formulas that were set 20 years ago, and that political compromise is very hard to adjust. We had a question somewhere right near to your right.
Thank you. I'm Karen Morangi. I work at a policy consulting firm, strategic communications firm in town here called the Rabin Group. And I always love these panels, and so thank you for doing this. I've worked on children's issues in various capacities, and our firm does youth policy and advocacy work across immigrant kids and criminal justice and so forth. So my question, particularly hearing about this lifespan endeavor or other research that you've done, if you had 300 million, 500 million given to you, politics aside, where do you think you get the most bang for your buck? You know, if you're a federal policymaker and all you care about is that for children 0 to 18, where would you put the money?
It's a great question for every member of our panel. Maybe we'll
And that was the question Belle asked me when I was working 10 years ago. I wrote this report, Cost-Effective Investments for Children, and the idea actually was that the plan at the time was we actually should make some hard budgetary choices. And I believe we had spending cuts and revenue increases. And then I had the easy chapter to write was let's give a dividend. If Congress does this hard work of cutting spending and raising revenues, let's then have a dividend. We spend, I've forgotten how much, it was more than 300 million, but some amount, maybe it was billions, on children. And at the time, I mean, early childhood education and this nurse home visiting program. And then, I don't know if the evidence 10 years later would back me up as much, but trying to do more with reforming schools in the K through 12 education. There's a lot of controversy now whether it's actually worked, but the value added and trying to really reform some of the ways teachers are paid. And then teen pregnancy prevention was the fourth place. So at that time, those were the four areas I chose. Again, I didn't put very much on health because 10 years ago I had troubles finding the studies that looked at health spending.
You want to put your top ones on the list,
Can
Bill?
I add to that? Yes.
Sure.
I would, to the teen pregnancy prevention, I would add reducing unplanned pregnancies generally, including amongst women in their 20s who tell us that they're not ready to have a child, don't want one yet, and who are having, 73% of them are having unplanned births that they themselves say they're not ready for. In Colorado, where they have had a big initiative to provide free forms of birth control, including the most effective forms, which are the IUD and the implant, free of charge. They normally would cost you $800. You know, what 22-year-old can afford that? With good counseling, they have reduced both the teen and the unplanned pregnancy rate amongst the 20-somethings by about half, and they have saved tons and tons of dollars from Medicaid and other social programs. And they have, based on other research that we've done, improved the life trajectories of the children as well as of the parents. Because if you're a child that's been planned for and your parents are ready to raise you, it makes a big difference. You're more likely to get prenatal care, you're more likely not to have your education or your career plans derailed, et cetera, et cetera. So and in fact, there is a group that advises philanthropists in this country called Bridgespan. And they use the lifespan or the life cycle model that you asked about, that I earlier described, that is here housed at the Urban Institute, to answer your question. And one of their top priorities was what I just said: reduce unplanned and teenage pregnancy.
Michael, you might even want to give this a little state twist too?
Sure, and I'd actually take a little bit of a different perspective on it, is that even before you're talking about new investments, especially in K-12 and higher education at the state level, you're just talking about getting back to pre-recession levels in terms of what states were putting in to education. Even in state level funding formulas, to the other gentleman's question, there's a lot of work there to do in terms of fixing funding formulas and how states are allocating resources to local school districts. In a number of states, they're actually regressive in that more impoverished communities get fewer dollars from the state, and they have local property taxes that just simply aren't able to raise those types of resources because they're property poor and housing values are low and haven't rebounded. And so I think that's a very interesting thing to keep in mind. On the higher education level, it's even more of a dire situation than it is at K-12. States are spending about $10 billion less overall on public 2- and 4-year colleges than they did before the recession. In a lot of states, that's meant increasing tuition. That's meant a kind of reduction in the quality of 2- and 4-year colleges. And so even before we're thinking about where that next dollar needs to go to build on what the federal government, what states are doing, I think there's another conversation about how we even get back to square one.
Karlyn, you might want to give this a public twist. I'm not necessarily identifying the ones in terms of research data, but are there things the public might be, of the types of things that have been mentioned by the other fellow panelists, that the public might be more supportive of?
Well, I personally couldn't begin to pick a program. I'm just not knowledgeable about any of them. I put my money on Bell. I mean, the work you've done on teen pregnancy is absolutely terrific, and the next wave of expanding that I think is really important. Of all the things that have been mentioned, I'm not sure I could put my finger on one of them and say this would be something the public would be really willing to accept or expand. Sorry.
Okay. So can I ask everybody who has who had their hand raised, raise your hand right now. Just want to see how many we have. We have 3. So I think we'll have time for all 3. I was going to do them all at once, but I think we'll go through we'll do you 3, and then we'll see if we have any other time. So please go ahead.
Hi, my name is Sanjeev Sriram. I'm a pediatrician here in Southeast DC. My question is mostly about minority children and the disparities that we see among the minority child population, which as we know, is becoming the majority of the American population in a short span of time. I was just wondering if there's any evidence showing correlations between declining federal investment and worsening or increasing disparities, either in terms of health, education, income, across those disparity lines.
Well, it's a bit of a overgeneralization, but what I've seen in the data on the various indicators you just mentioned is widening class gaps, widening socioeconomic gaps. Now, race and socioeconomic status are highly correlated, but when you look at race by itself, those gaps are, if anything, in many areas declining some. They're still very wide. We shouldn't be accepting of them, but they're not, as far as I can tell, in most of the areas that I look at anyway, going in the wrong direction. The socioeconomic ones are.
Define what you mean by socioeconomic. You mean like income, wealth?
Income and wealth, yep.
And I was going to say something similar in that it's not quite what you asked, but I was thinking of the other reverse direction, that because there's more inequality, there's more disparities, which one could say makes more need that there be federal investment. So I was looking at it sort of the reverse than you were. But that's what I'm also seeing, is it does seem there's more inequality than there was, which gets back to what we do think is that parents want to raise their children, and when there's more inequality, it's harder for parents to do that completely on their own.
It's interesting when that comes up, and obviously in my work, I'm thinking all the time about what the public perception is of certain government programs, the racialization of government programs, and whether or not that erodes or builds support for investing in those things, and especially in higher education, as more and more students of color come onto college campuses, something that has always popped into my brain, and I'd be curious about perhaps the polling behind this, is that as it becomes more visible that college campuses or K-12 schools are more and more diverse places, what are the implications of that for the kind of general will to put public dollars into those things? And we can look at it also just in terms of how various states look demographically. In many southern states, there has been a very strong resistance to expanding Medicaid. There is also very large African American populations in a number of southern states. And so some of those things do become very much linked, and it's very hard to kind of separate those things as being other than anything else other than and tied to race.
Those are really important questions that I don't think we know the answer.
I just add a footnote to this. If you look at after transfer, after tax, inequality. There's some reports, like even by CBO, that says it hasn't necessarily grown. The before tax, the private earnings and the private wealth have really increased. The question is how much they've been offset by other items. However, those reports, gets into this question of how you allocate the budget, are largely influenced by counting health care at cost. So when you put huge amounts of transfers into very expensive health care, you actually have, and there's not time to go into the detail, but you have big effects on how you're affecting those numbers, and also what you actually can do otherwise if you'd put the money elsewhere. And who were the other two questions we had? The ones we had before, I'm sorry.
Thank you. My name is Claire Barnett. I'm Executive Director of Healthy Schools Network. And good to see you, Bill. I am this has just been a really terrific panel conversation, a wonderful report. I'm very grateful to see it again. Just a reminder, I want to get back to the original question about how do we elevate children in this overall public conversation. In our own work, we do a triennial report, State of the States, on conditions of schools and children's environmental health. Our top line data is that there's slightly fewer public schools, more children in the schools, more children with asthma, more children with special needs, more children on free and reduced price lunch, fewer dollars and fewer staff. If you're thinking about how schools manage their facilities in terms of indoor air quality or taking care of asbestos, lead in the drinking water or something else, you have an obvious problem. You've got a problem now with school facilities. So I think there's an overall question for us, since all of these programs at EPA and at CDC on children's health and conditions of schools have all been cut, if not totally zeroed out, in the last 4 years or so. How do we elevate children in evidence-based programs for children in view of sort of this political conversation we're all in the middle of? I mean, it's really a disaster for kids at a state level, I think. Thank you.
I'm not sure what to say beyond what we've said so far. It's interesting to hear about your perspective on it. I do think, as I said at the beginning, and where we all did, that this report and any media attention it gets will help. There are other people. There's the Annie E. Casey Foundation's Kids Count projects, where they collect data state by state on how kids are doing. And I think those kinds of efforts do have value. And then we have to go to Karlyn and ask, well, how is the public reacting to knowing these things? It would seem to me that the environmental issue writ large, not just the school environment piece of it, is a way to make people think about what kind of legacy are we leaving to the next generation. And I am not a pediatrician, obviously, and not an expert, but I have been very surprised about the data I've seen on children's health, especially various types of mental health, have been worsening rather than getting better. And I don't understand that, and I would love some of you who do to tell me why that's happening.
That's a great lead, and we have a question from one of our viewers that even though there is increased federal funding for children's health, what niche federal funding streams are dedicated to children's mental health services, both ACA, Accountable Care Act, and non-Accountable Care Act related? How do we diversify that portfolio of funding, and should we prioritize this given the administration's attention to mental health treatment? Anyone want to comment on mental health? Julie, what did we have breakouts of the report?
So we look at Medicaid as a whole and we look at CHIPS separately, but we're getting into a lot of weeds in this report, but we've not gotten down into the spending within Medicaid and how that's spent. We'd have to look to, I'm sure there's other research out there, but not in this report.
Okay, we had a question. Here. We had one here, then we can be the last question from the audience.
Cool. I didn't think I was going to get to do mine. Elizabeth Gaines, Forum for Youth Investment. I'm so glad you have a state person here. I'm a longtime state advocate, and I think I'm personally frustrated and tired with fighting at the federal level for these things, and even at the state level for these things. And so increasingly, I've been turning to cities and counties and working with progressive leaders in those places that are interested in creating their own local public dedicated funding streams to support children and youth services, everything from pre-K to community schools to youth employment, whatever their need is in their local community. And I would just be curious, I get that we can't sort of ditch the federal effort and go to the local level to do these things, but in putting a package together to make your city or county compelling for people to live in and be a part of this modern, society we're trying to create, is there some mix of an answer that includes local dedicated funding? Philly just did the soda tax. It's going to be $91 million a year potentially for pre-K, community schools, parks and rec. That's not insignificant for,
Yeah, I mean, there have been...
Let me, since we're running out of time, I think I'm going to combine that with the last question to all of you, which is sort of along the same lines. What are given this session, given what you know now, what are the one or two things you might do now to try to influence this public debate, including in the direction that was just asked you? You can go ahead and start, Belle, and we'll have this be...
The one thing I would do, that's too tough for me, but I think you're right that it's probably good to go state and local. And I think that even though as economists, people like Jean and myself and others don't like earmarked taxes, they have a role in the political system. The tobacco tax was used for investments in children, right? Maybe someone should be fighting in the states that are now legalizing marijuana to have some of those revenues, maybe all of them, earmarked for kids. I think that's a political battle one could win.
Julia, go next.
Well, I guess I'm working on another report that looks at differences between state and local spending on children, and they're profound. And so I guess I'm going to be the one that wants to have the federal government a big part of the package, because it just seems if we want an equal playing field, that if some children grow up where there's very little spending and some grow up where there's more, and you add that to the differential in parental income, then it's just, I see the federal government playing a role in trying to make sure every child has sort of, a decent start in life so that they can then play on the field.
Michael?
So I absolutely agree that local governments can play a huge role in this conversation and in creating programs and services that are directed at kids. I think, however, at the same time, states really do, from a budget and tax perspective, set the ground rules for local governments. And that's in a number of different ways. Whether or not a local property tax can increase in any given year can be set at the state level. What amount of state money will be sent down to a local government in terms of revenue sharing is a state decision. Preemption laws at the state level can eliminate any progress that is made in any given city or locality. And so while local governments are huge, and they're often on the front lines in terms of providing a lot of these services, state lawmakers can, exactly. And so then also to that last question, I think that just very strong and responsible state fiscal policy plays a huge role here. The prioritization of investing in state budgets versus tax cuts, having transparency in your state tax expenditures, looking at proper fiscal planning so that the next recession that comes through doesn't mean huge cuts to programs that we care about, are all very important factors that you have to look at, especially from a state perspective.
Karlyn, last word.
I'm not sure what the relative weight should be, but I clearly know that public opinion is most supportive of work at the state and local level right now. And just to add, I spend a lot of time looking at millennials. They tend to lead change, particularly young people in college. And the change that we've seen in their attitudes about being involved in Washington versus being involved at the state and local level is really quite significant. They think they can make a difference at their state and local. So that's a silver lining for some of these other problems.
All right, well, let's give a round of applause to Heather and Karlyn, Michael, Belle, and Julia. Thank you so much. Kids Share, if you're interested in tweeting.